Hi everyone, and welcome to this Lunch and Learn. My name is Sofia Löfstrand, and I am a project manager at Dry Sweden, and this is my colleague Martin.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a project manager in communications at AI Sweden, and this Lunch and Learn is a joint event between our organizations, AI Sweden and Drive Sweden. And before we get started with today's presentations, I would like to remind you to mute your microphones and stop your cameras. Perfect. So this Lunch and Learn is about AI and visualization for research and business intelligence. And with us today to present about a project on this is Gustaf Nelhans and Johan Eklund from Högskolan i Borås Data as Impact Lab. And they will be here in just a few seconds.
So before we hand over to them, I just want to explain a little bit about the background of why we are here together today. And it's due to a quite interesting project we did with the Swedish Traffic Administration, where we at Dry Sweden and AI Sweden did a pre-study on how to use AI more in the planning of the transport system. And in that work, we did a lot of search of information. We did interviews, workshops, we looked at newspaper articles or internet paper articles, and also scientific publications, and kind of drowning in all the information that's available out there. So as an example, for the newspaper articles, we used a program called Retriever to search and find a lot of interesting stuff. But from 4,000 articles, we found 59 that were really interesting for our case. So when we came to the scientific part, we kind of had too much already, and we needed the help from some experts. So to present today, Gustaf and Johan will talk a little bit more about what they did in the project that we did together, and also what the potential is for these methods in other areas. So please, Gustaf and Johan, take the stage.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting us here to talk to you today. We will talk a little bit about what we did in the project, but mainly we will try to talk a little bit more about what we can use these technologies that we work with, rather than actually giving the contents of the report, because that report and the methods are described there. But if you have read it or seen it, you will see that some of the things that we talk about today will also be found there. Well, we come from Library and Information Science, which is a research area in University of Borås, and we study information in different ways. And I study specifically bibliometrics, which is the statistical analysis of scientific articles, one could say, with a specific focus on citations. I will come back to that in a minute. And Johan mainly works with text in various ways and information retrieval. And we have tried to, within this lab that we have started, we have tried to combine these two pieces of theory and ways of working with research to create something that is quite new. There are others that are working on it internationally, but we are going to international conferences and presenting our things as interesting things that are found at these conferences. Well, so I will start just to say something about bibliometrics and specifically the citation, because the citation is very important in the work that we do here, because we try to combine the references that become citations in the citation index and text in our analysis. Going back 50 or 70 years maybe, the citation index as an ID was created by Eugene Garfield, who saw that we need a way to identify empirically how history has developed within research. And he had an idea that by following references, we could follow the history backward and forward in time to understand how research has developed, because the publication is so important. the background of this is, of course, that philosophy of science has an idea, or maybe theory of science, that the text is the final output of all research in various ways. Of course, we use models and we create them and so on, but they are always communicated through texts which are published. And the so-called scientific norm system says that research should be openly available to everyone. It should be communal or even communistic. It should be universal, meaning everyone should be able to have the right to do research. It shouldn't be closed to anyone from any social level or ethnic background or gender or whatever. The researcher should be disinterested, not taking claims as personal, but being open to change when new results come out. And most specifically for the work with bibliometrics, the organized skepticism, which is institutionalized in the peer review system, is a very, very important thing. And Robert Merton was a sociologist of science who wrote about this in the mid-1900s, and one of his books, On the Shoulders of Giants, uses a quote from Newton saying, "If I have seen further, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants." And the idea of using references as a way of looking into history is built on this quote in a way, or this quote illustrates this in a very good way. So in the 60s, another historian of science, Director Sala Price, came up with the idea that we can look at the network of scientific papers, and we can look at them almost as a genealogy. So you follow a family tree in a way. And to the right, I have something that I did maybe a couple of years ago, where you can see that we follow from history, from the top and down to today, so to speak, at the bottom. And just looking at each article, in this case, each node is an article here, it gets very blurry very quickly. So instead, we in bibliometrics, there have been developed different ways of working with aggregating the data. In this case, I show in a way that the co-citation is the intellectual base of the research. Articles that are often cited together also forms some kind of intellectual base that we stand on or look backwards to. And on the other hand, right now, what is published right now could be talked about as the research front. And looking then at which articles, which researchers, or which journals are right now publishing research in this area that we are looking at, we can see it as that we are trying to identify these research fronts. In a way, we can see this as a space-time model or something like that, where we go from history and forward to the future. In practice, then, this could look like this. This is material that we used in the presentation, where we looked at the background. Where is the history of the research when it came to air quality research? And we looked at air quality in relation to artificial intelligence. And by looking at these different clusters, we could find different historical paths, so to speak, from where the research came. These are the articles that are often cited in the material that we identified, or the data set that we created. On the other hand, we could look into the future, and this is data from a completely different data set, but it is on scientometrics, the field that we are working on here. And scientometrics, that journal, in this case, these are journals, that is, of course, central to the field of scientometrics. But we can also see to the right that a lot of people working in physics are very interested in working with network models and looking at the research. And to the left, we see the traditional library and information science researchers. So in a way, we can see that there are different groups working on bibliometrics just by looking at this picture. Lastly, when it comes to bibliometrics, we can look at words. And in this case, we use something that we call co-word analysis. Words that often occur together are related to each other. And this is again from the traffic safety part of the study that we did. And for example, we could show that when the convolutional neural networks were used, that technology was used, or that AI technology was used mostly on computer vision, feature extraction, and image analysis in a way. While when we looked at the model logistic regression, we could find that in our data set, GIS and geography was the area where, or maybe environmental research, was the area where logistic regression, that technique was used. Lastly, when reinforcement learning was used as a method that was linked to autonomous vehicles, for example, Internet of Things, and so on. Just an example for what we can work with this. So we have what we can call a research program in our research where we combine texts and references or citation data into what we call then, well, we talk about this then, we use references as if they were words in our analysis. So when there is a reference, for example, we can change that and say that this is a word, whatever word that is. The point is that we can look at which words are used, for example, when a specific reference is cited. And this could look like this. This is a text that we have worked with. This is from medical research, not from exactly the project that we worked on here. But first of all, we can see which article cites which one, these numbers at the top. And then we see 20 words, the reference ID, and then 20 words again. And these are then extracted from the full text of the material. And what we can do then is to create, for example, a model of how, in this case, terrorism is mentioned when researchers talk about this is in medical research in a specific data set, quite broad data set. When terrorism is talked about, these are the areas that are found. And the point here, which is not so easy to see in this image, but you can sometimes see numbers. And these are IDs from PubMed, a publication database. And these are intermingled with words. And for example, the number, the ID that starts with 15 and ends with 83, this is this specific article on mental health, social functioning, and disability in post-war Afghanistan soldiers. And we can see when we look at the map that when that article is cited, researchers use the terms war, Iraq, humanitarian, asylum, seekers, and so on. So we can see that just by looking at this, we can see that there is some resemblance of likeness just by looking at this map. Of course, we can also measure this, how close we come. Here's another article, which is about bicycle commuter safety rates. And when that article is cited in the material that we look at here, they mention crashes, motorcycles, pedestrians, which of course are quite close to the interest of traffic in different ways. And so on. Here's one about conspiracy theories, which is in the psychological topic, so to speak. And lastly, we have one article on bullying, on cyberbullying, and that is directly between the words bullying and cyberbullying. When those words are used and other words that you see around it here, that article is mentioned. So by using this, we can combine references, how research is used with the content of the actual research that is done. And that is one way that we can work with these materials. Now I would like to leave the words to Johan. Let's see. Yes.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Johan Eklund, senior lecturer at Högskolan in Borås, focusing on text mining and the use of artificial intelligence for extracting information from text and classifying text and also modeling language. So I'm going to say a few words about how we have used artificial intelligence in this project, this recent project, but also the potential for AI in text mining in particular. So a lot is said about artificial intelligence these days. We can encounter it often as a marketing term to highlight that this product is using modern technology. And what is then AI really? And to put it briefly, one can say that whenever we talk about artificial intelligence, we refer to something that appears to have a human-like behavior or perception and also understanding. something that can solve a problem resembling human intelligence. But the large research area within AI is called machine learning, which refers to different techniques for creating systems that can learn from different kinds of data and different situations to solve various problems. For instance, to classify a collection of texts or classify a collection of images in order to use them, for instance, in autonomous vehicles. Within machine learning, we find an area that has received a lot of attention in later years called deep learning, which is, one could say, one possible way to perform machine learning using so-called neural networks, and where one can say that the architecture created to perform machine learning has a greater complexity than traditional machine learning. And this is something I'm going to say a few words about. So when we talk about traditional machine learning, we refer to processes where the researcher has to be involved to a large extent by, for instance, providing good representations of the items that are supposed to be learned, for instance, for classification. So that means that the researchers also have to have a lot of knowledge about the objects or the material that they are going to apply the different AI algorithms for. Whereas deep learning refers to processes where we stack different learning layers in a sequence so that these systems can also learn the representations themselves. And this particular branch has then become very popular and successful for various tasks like, for instance, image classification and computer vision. So this is an example of deep learning in action using a so-called convolutional neural network that Gustaf mentioned, where we can see the different layers in the learning process. And these are meant to resemble the architecture or the structure of the human brain. And each layer will learn a different level of abstraction in the images. So it's a process from the single pixels up to more abstract motifs, for instance, the car brand in this case. And this has become a success story when it refers to image classification and computer vision. But in recent years, we can also see that these new learning methods have been successfully applied to language and text analysis. And this is what I'm going to talk about in particular now. So what then do we mean by when we talk about text, and what is the problem involved when we want to analyze a large collection of texts of various kinds? And I want to introduce this image. I guess there are other similar images as well, that we can think of text as we do about trains, namely that text basically is a sequence of words, just like a train is a sequence of cars. And they are connected in a specific way, which we also think of in language. We call it syntax, how to construct sentences from single words. And each car in a train carries a particular kind of content. And this also resembles how we view words in language, carrying different meanings, what we call the semantics of the words in language. In the early models of machine learning, as well as so-called information retrieval, the representations of the text themselves were quite simple, even primitive, often using something called bag of words models, meaning that the texts, before being analyzed and, for instance, classified by the system, were split into the words that the text consisted of, so that the text were transformed into what we could call bags or collections of words, disconnected from their original context. And one might wonder how this could work at all, that we could just extract the words, put them in, for instance, alphabetical order, and use that as a representation of the text themselves. But it has worked to a certain extent, but of course we lose also a lot of information using such approaches. But this is an approach still used, and in the early days of machine learning, it was what I could call the dominant model. But in recent decades, one has started to think more about how language really is structured. For instance, when it comes to relations between words. So it is not the case in reality that words are isolated islands or phenomena, but rather form different semantic groups and networks. And this information gets lost in a very simple primitive model like the bag of words models. So in recent decades, it has become more and more popular to try to capture information about semantic relations using models from, for instance, geometry, creating so-called word spaces. So we utilize vehicles like vectors, for instance, which can capture also the relationships that appear when words are used together in different ways. So we can find words appearing in the same context and perhaps even in the same sentences following each other. And this can be captured in different statistical models, and these statistical models can then be also utilized in the systems performing, for instance, text categorization. And this is an example of a visualization of such a word space, and the idea is that words being close to each other in this illustration are also believed to be semantically close to each other. And this is something that is identified by their use and the co-occurrence in paragraphs and sentences, for instance. And one of the methods we have used in this recent project is, one could say, a modern extension of that idea to create representations of words such that words can be mapped into a space where the geometric similarity between these representations also correspond to their semantic relations and similarities in language use. And Google Research has developed several very popular and effective such language models, of which one is called Universal Sentence Encoder, where the basic idea is to first create semantic representations of the single words in language, and then create representations on sentence level so that we can capture what does a sentence mean, composed by a sequence of words. And this Universal Sentence Encoder utilizes a deep learning method called deep averaging network to first create a kind of semantic average of the words in the sentences and then train on those averages. And we have used this as a kind of fishing rod or fishing tool to find interesting paragraphs and even sentences in the text that we have been working with. So we have started with a reference phrase, which we can regard as a kind of query. And then using these sentence representations, we have tried to identify sentences within the scientific text that share a lot of similarities with this reference sentence. So they have a high semantic similarity, one could say. And we can see some of the sentences that were identified as the most similar ones. And the diagrams to the right illustrates the sequence of sentences within the text and the semantic similarities. We can see that there are some peaks here and there, and those are referring to the most interesting sentences. So this is an example of how we can use modern language modeling as well as deep learning to also successfully work with text retrieval. Another kind of idea that has become very successful in recent years is called attention mechanism. Namely that when these computer systems are supposed to learn semantic relations between words, that cannot be performed just on a word level, but we also need to look at words in their particular contexts. And this idea called attention means that when we want to identify what a word means, for instance, before it is translated into another language, the system should learn what other words in the context it should pay special attention to when trying to understand what this particular word means. So not every word in the previous context has the same importance, and therefore the system needs to learn which words to pay certain attention to. And this idea has been captured in recent language models, of which this one mentioned here, called BERT, is perhaps the most popular and I would say also famous one in the research community. It's also a product from Google Research. And basically it's trained on learning so-called masked models. Namely, if we exclude certain words from the text, which words have been excluded? So the system is supposed to learn which words that are missing in the text, and by doing so, it learns a lot about contextual information. It can also learn how to predict which, if a certain sentence is probable to follow another sentence or not. Using this kind of training methodology, Google Research has managed to develop language models that, especially this model called BERT, that offers a performance on various language tests or linguistic tests that is superior to anything we have seen so far. And in this text, we can see that there are different tasks that are supposed to be performed. For instance, to study the so-called sentiment in texts and predict what kind of emotions are expressed in this particular text, called sentiment analysis. Or another problem could be, is this sentence a paraphrase of another sentence? So it's basically a rewording of another sentence, for instance, the previous sentence. Does this sentence contradict the previous sentence, or does it agree with it? So we can even introduce some kind of logical inference using these most modern language models. And another problem area is to create systems for answering particular questions. So one problem that we have applied these modern language models like BERT to is called named entity recognition, which refers to processes where the system is supposed to identify names of things, for instance, names of persons, names of locations, names of time points, and so on, and mark these in the text so that we can extract them from the text labeled as, for instance, a person name, a geographic name, and so on, and also connect them together to form machine-readable facts about things, which often include named entities. Another method that we have used a lot in this recent project with AI Sweden is called question answering. And this is one of the problem areas that I personally foresee will receive much more attention in the upcoming years. Using question answering, the problem is to identify the sections in a collection of text that contain or are probable to contain the specific answers to specific questions. Like, for instance, in this text, we can find the answer, where is the headquarter of Google? It's somewhere in the text, but it's not expressed exactly using those words. But still, we can infer using question answering methods that the answers are probable to be right there in the text. And for this project that we have been a part of, we have trained a system to use or to identify answers in scientific texts, and therefore we also have used models based on scientific articles. So these are language models that have been trained on a large collection of scientific articles and therefore are well acquainted with scientific language. And we can see some examples of questions that we have asked to the abstracts that we have analyzed. For instance, what methods are used to measure and analyze traffic flows in the road traffic network? And here are some suggested answers extracted directly from the abstracts. Another question has been what measurements methods and types of data sources are used to map and analyze air quality. And again, we can see some phrases extracted from the abstracts that are believed to be answers to these questions. And also, which I'm going to say as the final words here, is the use of text summarization, which is a somewhat forgotten or neglected use of text analysis, namely to try to capture the overall content of a text by summarizing it in just a few sentences. And to this end, we have also used these recent deep learning-based language models. And these are some examples of short, we can call them abstracts, that have been generated. And the principle here is that these sentences are not only extracted from the text, but they are generated by the language models. So this involves some kind of language understanding. And just to get a brief understanding of, or a quick understanding of the text, having access to such very short abstracts could be also very valuable to researchers trying to get acquainted with, for instance, a new research field. So that was, I think we...
Yes, I think we are perfectly in time, if I understand it. So what I just wanted to end this part of the seminar is to just say a few words about the program that I talked about before. Combining bibliometrics or scientometrics with text analysis, specifically semantic analysis, but other kinds of text analysis is also possible. There are a broad group of things that we could work with. Generally, bibliometrics is used for evaluating research, or it's often known in that way, or for measuring, is my research good enough? Am I ready to be a docent in Sweden, for example, or can I get a job in front of somebody else? But what we have shown here is that bibliometrics or scientometrics has so many more uses and can be used together very forcefully when you use text analysis and these citation analysis techniques together. And these are just some of the materials that we have worked with, or ideas that we talk about explorative scientometrics instead of evaluative scientometrics. We use question answering as a technique, for example, but many others also. We look at the context of references or of the citation in the text, and by that being able to combine how research is used, not just what is said within the research. And lastly, we have in other projects extended this to look at other areas of research impact, so to speak. One that is very well known, I haven't written it here, but you often talk about altmetrics, measuring how many tweets or how many Facebook posts that have been put up that cites this research. But again, you miss so much information when you just count the instances. It's much more interesting to look at the content. And professional impact is, for example, in medical research, looking into clinical guidelines, which clinical guidelines and what is the content of the guidelines that cite the research that is done in academia. So again, using these techniques, we can follow the material in different ways. And just I just remembered one thing that I want to mention also, that for example, the technique that is used by Google in the Google search engine, the PageRank algorithm, is directly a derivative of scientometric research and studies that were done in the 1970s in scientometrics that then became the basis of the whole idea of using bibliometric or using links as a way of evaluating search results in Google. So that is an example of how forceful these techniques are. So with that, I want to end my presentation here and give the word again back to Sophia.
Thank you very much, both Gustaf and Johan, for your presentations. You could say that without understanding everything that you said, I can certainly understand how we can use your competence and your knowledge. We have had a very good collaboration and using all this science to extract information in our case. And I wanted to start with a question about just that, because we were looking at, Gustaf, you were kind of helping us with the bibliometric science of finding what could be interesting out there when it comes to scientific publications. And then the next step was, as I see it more, Johan, how do we search for what is the absolute most interesting in that space? Yeah. So we use it for scientific publications, but could we use the same methods for other sources of information, for newspaper articles or even social media? Is it just to copy and paste, or how could you work on it?
Yes, to a certain extent it is, but of course Bibliometrics has these established databases that we work with, and they help us getting the data in a tidy format that is easier to work with. But extracting information even from PDFs is possible, but not so fun to work with always. But then you can use different ways of categorizing the information. For example, the meta information about who is the author, from what lab or from what organization does this text come from. So in a way, it can be used in these ways. And the whole of the web is based on the idea of linking and presenting text. So in that way, links are there, and the links work a little bit as references within the internet. So in that case, yes, it is possible in many different ways.